One. Hi, everyone. Hello. Welcome. We're so excited to have you this evening. Thank you for joining us. I welcome you all into the new year, and we welcome you back to Tattered Cover virtual events. My name is McKaylee. I work with Tattered Cover Bookstore. If this is your first virtual event with us, welcome. We're so excited to have you guys here and joining us online. And if this is old hat for you, welcome back. I hope you got a bit of a break from some of our virtual events and seeing me moderate some of these, but I'm excited that we're going to have many moderators this year, and we're really trying to vamp up our virtual events. So thank you guys for logging on and for watching and for registering for these events as well. If you are new to our virtual events, Tattered Cover Bookstore is a local bookstore in Denver, Colorado. We turned 50 this year, 50, which is quite an amazing feat for an independent bookstore. We have 4 locations in the Denver metro area, and right now they are all open to the public. Limited capacity for browsing. We ask that you come in wearing your mask over your nose and your mouth, and you can come and shop with us for about 90 minutes. But as always, our website is open 24/7, and we cannot tell you how much we appreciate local support. It's the reason that we're able to stay open during these trying times. And it's also the reason that we're able to host amazing authors on these virtual events that we have here. So shopping locally is hugely important. And the reason that we're able to keep doing this is you. So thank you. So closed captioning, also, I want to let you know, closed captioning is enabled for those who might need it, which is why we choose YouTube as a platform. The way to enable that is on the screen that you're watching me on right now. If you toggle your mouse over the bottom, there's a black bar at the bottom. The button CC should enable closed captioning for you. There, should you want or need it. And now I want to, very quickly, I want to let you know about an upcoming event that we have here. We have this week Amber Ruffian and her sister Lacey Lamar for their book, You'll Never Believe What Happened to Lacey. And then on Friday, we have Jeff Roberts, who's talking about his new book, Kings of Crypto, which is about a brief history on cryptocurrency, as well as the future of it. But I want to talk about the author and the book that we have here tonight. I'm so excited for you guys to hear this presentation. And this book is so fascinating, guys. I mean, I'm a theater and English major, and when I read this book, I was like, what? I learned so much, and you're going to learn an amazing amount tonight as well. So a little bit about our author. Daniel Lieberman is a paleoanthropologist at Harvard University, where he is the Edwin M. Lerner II Professor of Biological Sciences and the chair of the Department of Human Evolutionary Biology. He is best known for his research on the evolution of the human head and the evolution of the human body. So it's my honor to welcome tonight Daniel Lieberman, and we're going to have him turn on his video and his microphone here. And there he is. Hi, Daniel.
Greetings. Thank you so much.
No, it's my pleasure. Like I said, I'm so fascinated to hear this talk because the book is interesting and well explained, especially for someone who is not a biologist. And I just really enjoyed it. And so I'm excited to hear you give us a summary and an overview in this presentation and just inspire others to get their copy and read it. So you have a presentation for us, yes?
Thank you. Yes. Okay. So let me just share my screen, and then we can, hopefully there'll be plenty of time for questions at the end.
Absolutely. So hold your questions during the presentation, and we'll take those after.
All right. Is that working well?
Yes, it is. We can see right there. Take it away.
All right. Well, thank you. So I was, the last time I published a book in 2012, I remember coming to the Tattered Cover Bookstore, and I loved my talk there. And I'm sorry I can't be there in person this year, but such is the world that we live in today. So I'd love to talk about my book, Exercised, why something we never evolved to do is healthy and rewarding. And as a kind of a start, let's just begin by imagining if this is a representative audience in the United States, right? If you're just average Americans, about 20% of you probably got 150 minutes of physical activity this week, which is what the World Health Organization and the US Surgeon General and the American Heart Association and every other major organization suggests is the minimum amount of physical activity we should get. But the other 80% of us hate to exercise and didn't do that, right? And many of us are ambivalent, we're confused, we're anxious, we feel bullied, we feel shamed about it. It's just not much fun, right? And so if you're one of those people, like, why on earth would you want to read a book about exercise? And there are all these kind of, books out there which, promise, like, 7 easy steps to get ripped and all kinds of stuff like that. But but we're not going to do any of that today. My goal today is and really the goal of this book is to help us become less exercised about exercise, right? And to be exercised, become anxious and vexed and nervous and worried about something. And it's not by accident that the word exercised and the word exercise share the same root. Before I go any further, I should thank a lot of folks. So my wonderful editor, Errol McDonald, and my agent, Max Brockman, have really helped make this book possible. There's a whole list of colleagues and students. I won't name all of them right now, but they all helped in various ways. I especially have to call out my wife, Tonya Prescott, who read every single chapter, and my running buddy and colleague, Dr. Aaron Bagish, who also read the whole book and talked about it with me on countless morning runs. But all kinds of other people helped in various ways. So thanks to all of them. So for the next 30 minutes, I want to start off with talking about why I wrote the book and what it's about, kind of just give you a kind of a little entree to kind of a raison d'etre about the book. And then I'd like to kind of talk about some of the myths of exercise. And each chapter of the book is not about a myth of exercise, but I use myths of exercise as a kind of narrative structure to kind of help us work our way through this natural history. So this is a true story. The book really began in 2012 when I was finishing up my last book called The Story of the Human Body. And as I was putting the kind of final sort of touches on that book, I was invited to a medical conference that accompanies the Ironman World Championship in Kona. And this is actually the view from the hotel where the conference is held. It's really kind of a great place to go if you can imagine how much fun it is. But I was not participating in the Ironman Championship. I was there to be at a medical conference and then to watch it. And if you don't know what an Ironman is, a full Ironman, it starts off with a 2.4 mile open water swim, which is kind of crazy if you ask me. I hate swimming. Then after the swim, they jump out of the water and get on their bikes, and they do a 112 cycle ride across this lava desert. It gets pretty hot. And then at that point, it's about 90 degrees Fahrenheit, and they get off their bikes and throw off their helmets and put on their running shoes and do just a full marathon in the heat. And it's pretty impressive to watch. And if you watch that kind of crazy event, you realize why the motto of Ironman is anything is possible, right? Except it's shouted by this guy, anything is possible, right? And when people cross the finish line, he says, you are an Ironman. And this is the guy who finished first that year, a guy named Pete Jacobs from Australia. He did it in just over 8 hours, which is just insane if you think about it. But really the most exciting finishes occur around midnight because you have to finish before midnight to be considered a finisher. And that year, this is the last woman to finish. Her name was Harriet Anderson. She was 77 years old. Here she's being greeted by the women's winner. So it's just really amazing to see what people put themselves through in order to do that incredible endurance feat. But I have to tell you, when I left that place, I was like, no way, I am never going to do that. I like running. I'm a pretty serious marathoner. But doing a full Ironman is definitely not for me, especially because of the swim. So anyway, a few weeks later, I packed my bags again and I headed off to northern Mexico, where I was doing some research among the Tarahumara, who are a very famous Native American tribe. They're famous for their running. I had not been there before, and I was expecting to see people all over the place running, but actually I didn't see anybody running unless I asked them to. But I was traveling around with a good colleague. We were traveling up into these remote pueblos in a pickup truck and talking to people and measuring them, etc. And there was, again, I was thinking about Ironman and like why people would put themselves through that kind of event when I got the chance to watch some of the famous Tarahumara races. So there's two of them. The first one is at the bottom is the women's race. It's called an aroete. And there's a kind of a cloth circle which they flick with these sticks, and the race is about 25 miles long. And there are two teams, and the team that kind of gets their cloth circle around the course first wins. And then after that, there's a men's race called a Rarahipuri, which can be any length. And sometimes they can be up to 40, 50, 60 miles long. And in the Rarahipuri, instead of a cloth circle, they've got a little wooden ball, and they kind of flick it with their feet. And then they find it, they chase it, and then they flick it again. And they keep doing this until one team laps the others. And again, these races can go on and on and on forever. It's a really impressive, amazing thing to watch. So I was like, measuring these folks and studying how they run. And I had this, good anthropologist. I had this list of questions I was asking everybody. And I remember there's this one guy, this is him actually, let's call him Ernesto. And he was in his mid 70s, but still a runner. And and I was asking him among all kinds of questions, including how he trained. And I have been having problems with this question with everybody, because when I was asking people how they trained, turns out there's no word for training in their language. And furthermore, it became pretty clear that they don't do that, right? Nobody gets up in the morning and runs 5 miles just to kind of get ready for one of these races. That's not how they prepare. The way they prepare is through their just regular lifestyle, which is just hard work, and also, I think, dancing. And so Ernesto, when I was asking him about how he trained, and the translator was helping me, was explaining how, like, this gringo, he gets up, he runs 5 miles a day, practices his speed, etc. I remember he asked me, why would anybody run if they didn't have to? And I remember at the time kind of laughing out of embarrassment, because yeah, that makes sense, right? These people are hardworking farmers. They struggle to get enough food to survive. Why would they, for no reason at all, go run 5 miles in the morning? And I realized at that point that I wanted to kind of study this question, right? Which is that exercise is a very weird modern behavior. And it's useful to distinguish between exercise and physical activity. So physical activity is basically moving, right? Any bodily movement that spends energy. But exercise is a special kind of physical activity. It's discretionary, it's voluntary physical activity that we do to stay healthy or become fit, right? And in the modern world, it's heavily commercialized and it's heavily industrialized. But until recently, nobody exercised. And for me, the apotheosis of exercise is the treadmill. Now, some of you may love your treadmills, and I do have a treadmill, and I put people on a treadmill for a living, but I actually hate running on a treadmill. Think about it. It's an expensive machine. You either spend money to buy one, or you spend money to go use somebody else's treadmill, and you work really hard, and you don't get to see anything, and you work, you sweat like a pig, and get absolutely nowhere on this kind of treacherous, loud, noisy kind of torture device. It's try explaining to your great-great-grandparents that you did this. They would think us crazy, right? Try explaining that to a hunter-gatherer or a Tarahumara or all kinds of other folks, right? And I got actually firsthand experience of this when in the field site that I've been working at for the last 12 or so years. It's up in Western Kenya, in the highlands. That's actually in the distance. I don't know if you can see here in this photo, that's Lake Victoria. And that's the town of Kisumu, where Barack Obama's father came from. But this is a very, very poor part of Kenya. Most of the people there are barefoot. There's no electricity. There's no running water. And women carry these amazing loads on their head, mostly water, but also firewood. And we wanted to study how women were carrying firewood and water and how much energy they spent carrying it and how they did it. So we actually drove a treadmill up there, which is not an easy thing to do because the roads really are difficult. You can get a sense of that from this video. And then we plugged the treadmill in the closest place you could, about 2 hours away from this community. And here's one of the women from the community, and we have an oxygen mask on her and all kinds of stuff. And if you had never walked on a treadmill at all your life, and suddenly you're in your 40s or 50s, and some scientists came and produced a treadmill, you'd have a hard time walking on it. And so did these folks. We had to actually abandon the treadmill after spending all that time and energy getting it up there. It's a very strange thing. And by the way, if you think treadmill's a torture device, you're actually right. Treadmills were invented in the Victorian era in order to punish prisoners. A guy named William Cubitt was the inventor of the kind of sort of pre-modern treadmill, and prisoners like Oscar Wilde were forced to trudge in them for 5-6 hours a day just to make sure they didn't enjoy themselves. So how did I end up studying and thinking and writing about the evolution of physical activity? Well, for me, it really began, I think we should probably begin the story when I was a kid, right? So this is me in like 7th grade. And as you can probably tell from the photo, I was a nerd. It's a cliche, but I really was picked last for probably every team in school. I actually once hid in a gym, in a closet to avoid going to gym one day because I was ashamed of my body and I felt very unathletic and I was just a kind of typical nerd, typical geek. But I did have a great role model, my mother. My mother was a professor, and she was at the University of Connecticut, and she wasn't all that fit. But in 1969, the University of Connecticut built a fancy schmancy gym that was not open to women, even though it was built with federal funds. And my mother was so mad at that. that she and a friend of hers started to run in order to liberate the gym. That was why she started running. And she ended up eventually not only liberating the gym, but also becoming addicted to running. And she ran 5 miles a day for 5 decades. She's still very physically active. She exercises every day. And I just thought, it's normal to have a parent who runs. And my father started running along with her and along with the dog. So I kind of picked up running as a kid, just because I thought that's what people did. And then, although we didn't really participate in sports very much, my parents would take us hiking and skiing all the time. So we would go hiking all over the place, and got lucky. I went to Switzerland and in New England, and I went skiing every winter. And I just thought it was normal to be physically active, although we didn't really participate that much in sports. Anyway, I grew up, became a professor, and I was kind of a skull guy. The start of my career was really about heads and skulls, and I ended up getting involved in a project about how we stabilize our head when we run. Because like this pig here, when it's running, it's able to flex and extend its neck to keep its head somewhat still, though that doesn't do a very good job. But humans can't do that. And turns out we have this interesting anatomical structure called the nuchal ligament, which we were studying and ended up doing lots of research in the lab about the biomechanics. And here's a headless runner, as you can see, and then ended up getting interested in the evolution of running and hunter-gatherer running. And bottom line is, in 2004, my colleague Dennis Bramble and I ended up publishing this paper in the journal Nature about the evolution of human running. And it was titled Born to Run on the cover of Nature. And from that, I got interested in barefoot running, because if humans evolved to run millions of years ago, they must have run barefoot until the invention of shoes. So I got interested in how people run barefoot. Before I knew it, I was getting interested in something called evolutionary medicine and the evolution of the human body and how that's relevant to health and disease. Now, studying running, in turn, fostered my own interest in running. So in 2007 was actually when I ran my first marathon. Here's a picture of me running that marathon. And then I like to try what I study. And because I was interested in running without shoes, I thought I should try barefoot running, and it turns out I really enjoyed it. So I got really interested in barefoot running. I also was interested in this idea that humans can run down animals. So I actually ran this marathon against horses in Prescott, Arizona. So I've got, running has been really kind of fun and wonderful and really rewarding for me. But it's also brought a lot of controversy, and the controversy for me really was highlighted by the whole barefoot running thing. So I had no idea what I was stepping into, but when we started studying barefoot running, I realized that there was a whole group of people who thought that basically barefoot is better, and that shoes are kind of bad and evil kind of corporate things, and they're like coffins for your feet, and nobody should ever wear shoes. And yet there was a whole other group of people who were saying that barefoot running was crazy and it's a stupid fad, and you need shoes that have support and cushioning. And like I was like a lot of folks in the middle, like what's going on? Like, why are these two diametrically opposed? So why are these people like so sort of exercised about barefoot running? And I really come to believe that we are extremely exercised about exercise in this culture, right? We're vexed, we're worried, we're anxious, and we're harassed about it. So in the context of barefoot running, is it better to be barefoot or wear shoes? And will running ruin my knees? And how much should I run? And on and on and on. And then of course there's so many other questions that people are exercised about. How do I actually get motivated to exercise in the first place? And how much weight should I do versus cardio? And how much? We're also exercised about inactivity, about sleep and sitting, and the list goes on and on and on and on. But the biggest problem, as I see it, is that not enough people exercise enough. According to the CDC and various other government agencies, less than 20% of Americans get the minimum recommended dose of physical activity, which is 150 minutes a week, right? That's pretty astounding amount, because if you think about it, that's just 21 minutes a day, right? That less than 20% of us actually get that minimum amount of physical activity. So why are we so exercised about exercise? And I think there's a bunch of reasons. So one is that there's a lot of confusing information, right? One day you read that running is really good for you, and then you read it's really bad for you, and one day you read you should do aerobic stuff, and then the next day you should do strength training, and people basically get whiplash. I think there's also this extraordinary focus on weight loss, right? I mean, so much about exercise and about health these days is all about weight loss, weight loss, weight loss, weight loss. And of course, it can be important. We'll talk about that a little bit later on, but that's not what exercise is all about. And it kind of biases the way we think about it. There's also, I think, way too much focus on elite athletes. Now, look, I love watching the world's greatest athletes do what they do. It's just amazing and it's inspiring and it's wonderful. But I would also argue that most of what they do has almost nothing to do with the rest of us, right? Most people don't spend years and years and years practicing and training to be really good at just one event, right? It's just not very relevant. But I think the largest problem is that we have a Western post-industrial bias to physical activity, right? Most of the data, almost everything we know about physical activity comes from studying people in the United States and in Europe and Australia and other kind of very, westernized, industrial, wealthy countries. But that's, of course, not representative of most of the world, and it's certainly not representative of most of humanity until recently, that we're not industrialized and not westernized and led very different kinds of lives. And the result is that we look at the physical activity and exercise through this very, very, very narrow lens and very narrow window. And so what I wanted to do is provide an alternative perspective, which I think is really necessary, and write a natural history of physical activity and exercise. And the book is really guided by two mantras. The first is that nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. That's because our bodies weren't designed, they weren't engineered, they evolved. And if you want to understand why they are the way they are, you need to understand that evolutionary history. And if you want to understand why we behave the way we do, you need to understand culture and anthropology. So nothing about behavior makes sense except in the light of anthropology. And so the book is organized in four sections, because if you want to understand physical activity, you first need to understand inactivity. The first section of the book is about rest. It's about resting metabolism and about sitting and about sleeping and things like that. Then, because most animals are built for speed and strength, part 2 of the book is about speed and strength and power and fighting and things like that. Because humans evolved to be spectacular endurance athletes, the next part of the book is about endurance physical activities like walking and running and dancing. And then finally, I apply all of that previous information to health and disease in the modern world. And so the book really is kind of a mix of anthropology and evolutionary biology and human biology and health science, but to make it narrative and enjoyable and fun and kind of personalize it, I tell it through the lenses of my own experiences and those of other people, right? So I tell lots of stories about how I've been very lucky and very fortunate to travel around the world and spend time with hunter-gatherers and subsistence farmers and do other kinds of experiences that hopefully will give some sort of context to this kind of natural history. And each chapter in the book, I also decided to kind of focus, or not focus, but kind of use a different exercise myth as a kind of a foundation or a kind of a structure, a framework for each chapter. And I think so. I thought it might be fun for the second part of this talk is to kind of go a really rapid tour through some of these myths, right? I'm not going to. This is just a fraction of the book, but it'll kind of give you a sense of how I think a kind of non-medicalized, non-industrialized, sort of anthropological evolutionary approach can help us think differently about exercise. So as I said before, the first part of the book is about inactivity, and the most important myth, as I said before, is that we evolved to exercise. And I call this the myth of the athletic savage, right? We have the sense that our ancestors were incredible athletes, and in a sense they were, right? They every day, if you can't walk to the local supermarket to get food, you have to go get it, right? And so it involved walking and carrying and digging and climbing. And people also had to often run, and they involved in dancing and all kinds of other sorts of physical activities. And so we have this kind of general idea that our ancestors were incredible athletes. Turns out that's not really true, right? If you look at what hunter-gatherers do in different parts of the world, they maximum out at about 2.25 hours a day of moderate to vigorous physical activity. So most of the day they're actually resting or doing very, very light chores. And they tend to be physically active really only under 2 conditions: when it's necessary or socially rewarding. So this idea that our ancestors were out there, running long distances on their own just for the sake of it is just absolutely not true. And so when energy is limited and you have to go get all the food you need through physical activity, and there are no machines to do any work for you, it makes sense not to spend energy on physical activity if it's not going to be beneficial for you, either in terms of getting food or for some social reason. And that explains this phenomena we've all seen, right? In a subway stop or an airport or a mall, like when you have a stair next to an escalator, right? Almost everybody wants to take the escalator, right? You have this little voice in your head which tells you to take the escalator. And in fact, in this picture, by the way, I had to Photoshop this woman onto the stairway because there actually wasn't enough people on the stairway for the photo. But the point is that we kind of virtue signal this kind of thing, right? Taking the stairs instead of the escalator. But let's be compassionate, because these folks actually, even though there were no escalators in the Stone Age, these folks are really being normal, right? They're avoiding unnecessary physical activity, and this highly virtuous woman is actually being abnormal, right, in terms of taking the stairs when she doesn't need to. Okay, so what is it we're doing when we're not exercising? We're not being physically active? Well, we're sitting most of the time, right? And sitting is also another one of those myths, right? So you probably heard that sitting is the new smoking, right? And that sitting will kill you, and your chair is out to kill you, and that you should get a standing desk, and just stop sitting, right? And it turns out that if you go to a hunter-gatherer camp, and this is, by the way, I walked into this particular hunter-gatherer camp. This is a Hadza camp. This is actually what I saw the second as I walked into the camp, right? What's everybody doing? They're sitting. And it turns out studies by Dave Reichland and colleagues have shown that hunter-gatherers sit about 9 to 10 hours a day, which is actually not all that different from Westerners, like these two somewhat disgraced or heavily disgraced leaders, right? Look how bored, by the way, they look, right? The sitting isn't obviously doing that much for them. But so sitting is actually not abnormal. Turns out, though, there are better and worse ways to sit. The book describes it. We talk about active sitting and interrupted sitting and differences between work time sitting and leisure time sitting, and so I don't want to kind of say that it's okay to sit all day long, but the point is that sitting for much of the day is not an abnormal thing. And furthermore, I should also note that it's leisure time sitting which is mostly associated with negative health outcomes, not work time sitting. So when I was interested in sitting, I was thinking, well, if we're told to sit less, how come we're also told to sleep more? And I got interested in sleep. And another myth out there is that the modern world, right, all the electricity, fueled devices that we have, TVs and light bulbs and iPhones and you name it, have all robbed us of sleep. And that in the old days, before people had these, Edison robbed us of sleep, people slept more. Well, it turns out that's just not true. People have gone out, and anthropologists have gone out and measured people in cultures and in places where there is no electricity and there are no TVs and iPhones. And it turns out they don't sleep 8 hours. They sleep between 5.7 and 7.1 hours a night on average, right? And furthermore, if you start looking at the epidemiological data in the United States and places like that, it turns out there's actually no evidence that 8 hours is even optimal. This is the relationship between how much sleep people get and how likely they are to get heart disease. And you can see it's a U-shaped curve. And for both men and women, this is, by the way, based on more than 1 million individuals, for both men and women, the optimal amount of sleep tends to be about 7. So we kind of, once again, this is an example of how we oversimplify evidence about physical inactivity and make people get really stressed about it. Because when somebody tells you you're not getting enough sleep, and it's true that if you're really sleep deprived, that is a health problem. But if say you're getting 6 or 7 hours and you're fine, right? And somebody tells you, no, you need 8 hours, then you start getting stressed about it. Stress makes your cortisol levels go up, and cortisol arouses you and prevents you from sleeping. And so you end up getting in this vicious circle. Okay, so that's enough on inactivity. Obviously, there's a lot more, but I'm not going to go into all of it today. And part 2 of the book is about speed and strength. And another myth out there is that normal humans trade off speed for endurance, right? You can either be a tortoise or you can be a hare. And that's true if you're an elite athlete. And this is, again, one of those instances where our focus on elite athletes, I think, really biases us, right? So here is Eliud Kipchoge. He's the world's fastest marathoner. And here is Usain Bolt. He's the world's fastest sprinter. And Kipchoge, when he runs a marathon, he's doing about 6 meters a second, does it a little over 2 hours, whereas Bolt is running almost 10.4 meters a second, and he can run 100 meters in less than 10 seconds. So if Bolt were to run a marathon at his sprinting speed, he can do it in a little over an hour. And if Kipchoge were running 100 meters at his marathon speed, he'd do it at a ridiculously slow pace of 16:57, which by the way, I'd love to run 100 meters in that time. But the point is, these guys are definitely trading off speed for endurance, but that's not true of the rest of us, right? People who are good at speed actually tend to be good at endurance. Think about soccer players, think about general all-round athletes. Actually, it's true for a lot of other animals. So it's only at these very, very elite levels that there's this trade-off. And in fact, one of the things that we've learned over the years is that one of the best ways to improve your endurance is actually to work on your speed. It's called high-intensity interval training. And I have tons of information in the book about how and why that works, and why it's a really great way of adding to your exercise regime, and not just to make yourself faster, but also to build up your endurance. Another myth out there is that we evolved to be super strong, right? That we're our ancestors were jacked and ripped, and they had these huge muscles. They were like, like think about the stereotype of Neanderthals. Well, when people have gone out and measured hunter-gatherers, it's just not true. They're not super strong. They're moderately strong. But actually, if they were really strong, it would be a problem for them because they don't need that kind of strength for their life. After all, they have tools and weapons like bows. But also, and muscle's really expensive. Muscle's about 20% of your metabolism, like your brain. And if you were to be heavily muscled, you need, like 200 to 300 more calories a day, which is really hard to get if you're a hunter-gatherer. But the big difference is that hunter-gatherers tend to use their muscles throughout their lifespan. So here's a graph of grip strength versus age, and hunter-gatherers versus plotted against English people. And you can see that hunter-gatherers tend to be about 75th percentile, but they tend to maintain their strength more throughout the lifespan because they don't stop using their muscles, because of course if you don't use muscles, you lose muscle, and that becomes a big problem in the West as people get what's called sarcopenia, or muscle wasting. They become frail. When you become frail, you have difficulty getting out of chairs. You start walking slowly, and it leads to this kind of vicious cycle, which leads to further physical inactivity, which makes you less well, and it's a terrible cycle to get into. So as you get older, it's really more important, not less important, to continue to do with a little bit of strength training to maintain your strength. Another myth I explore is that sports have something to do with exercise, and it's true sometimes, but really the origin of sports is really about mostly teaching individual skills for combat. Think about what the Olympics is all about, javelin throwing and wrestling and chariot racing, which we don't do anymore. And throughout the world, you find lots and lots of sports which are really about these really about fighting in various ways. American football, this fantastic game which I describe in Florence called Calcio Storico. These are really all about combat. And the other reason I think that sports are really important is that is to teach individuals, especially when we're young, not just skills and help develop capacities, which are important, but also to teach us not to be reactively aggressive. So reactive aggression is that instantaneous aggression that we have when somebody does something and just reach out and you bash somebody. But that's not acceptable in human nature, right? We're trying to teach children not to lash out at each other. Instead, humans are really good at what's called proactive aggression. So it's really basically what underlies being a good sportsman. So if somebody scores a goal against you, you don't hit them, right? And you learn not to be a bad loser. Okay, so that's power and speed and strength and fighting. The next part of the book is about endurance, because that's really what humans evolved for. In fact, the most fundamental form of physical activity, of moderate physical activity, is walking. That's what we're evolved to do, right? We're champion walkers, right? And recently, it's been argued that that walking actually is not so useful for weight loss. And in fact, you can see all kinds of articles on the web about how walking, physical activity in general, is not very useful for weight loss. But let's look a little bit deeper. The first is that the average walking that people used to do until recently was between 6 and 9 miles a day. So women average about 6 miles a day, men average around 9 miles a day in pre-agricultural societies. So to put that into perspective, if you walk 6 miles a day, you walk from essentially LA to Washington, DC every year. That's normal, right? That's what people do. And by the way, you do that carrying stuff as well. So of course, people today walk just about 2 miles a day, and that includes all their steps to and from the bathroom, into their car, etc. Now, if you walk a mile, you spend about 50 extra calories, which is like pittance compared to, say, a helping of fries or Gatorade or whatever. So it's for that reason people often say physical activity is just kind of, especially walking, is just useless for weight loss because you really have to walk a lot to work off those calories. The problem is that we've been looking at most of the experiments that look at walking and weight loss look at that standard recommendation of 150 minutes a week. Remember, that's just 21 minutes a day. And yes, if you walk 21 minutes a day, and then maybe you're a little bit hungry afterwards, you're not going to, you're going to quickly, wipe out any energy benefits. But nonetheless, you could still, if you manage not to compensate by eating, you can lose about a half a pound a month, which translates to about 6 pounds a year. Now think about that. That's if the average American who's dieting is trying to lose 50 pounds. That's not a lot, right? So it's true. If you want to lose weight rapidly, and there's no question that dieting is more effective than walking. But if you look at a somewhat more evolutionary normal dose, like just double that to 300 minutes a week, that's 42 minutes a day, right? If you do 40, and there are plenty of studies which show that if you walk just 40 minutes a day, day after day, you lose about a pound a month, which can translate into 12 pounds a year, which is actually not insubstantial. And even higher levels of physical activity can help you lose more weight. And more importantly, physical activity is not so, again, as I said before, it's not the best way to lose weight, but it is important for keeping weight off. So here's a study that was done actually here in Boston on policemen, where they had a bunch of policemen who were given some dieted and some dieted plus also exercised, and you can see the ones who dieted and exercised lost more weight than the dieters alone, but not a lot. But here's the key difference, because after the diet was over, the ones who didn't exercise pretty much all regained the weight that they lost, but the ones who continued to exercise managed to keep the weight off. And many, many, many studies have shown the same thing, that physical activity, again, doesn't help you lose that much weight, a little bit, but what's really important is it prevents either weight gain or weight regain, which is what happens after diets, right? People lose the weight and they gain it back again. And so there's no question that if you're going to be interested in weight loss, walking can be a useful component of a weight loss program. Now, if walking is the fundamental form of moderate physical activity, running is the fundamental form of vigorous physical activity. But yet we have another myth, which is that running causes wear and tear on our knees, right? It wears them down and you get arthritis. And this is, again, another one of these myths, right? It is true that knee injuries are the most common site of injury for runners. And I would argue actually that part of that's because running is a skill, in my opinion, and that there are better and worse ways to run, and that a lot of the injuries that people get are caused by people running poorly, and also because they haven't adapted their body appropriately to the forces that they're experiencing. But even so, there's no evidence that running actually causes arthritis in the knee. There's quite a few prospective, randomized control studies which show that people who run more are not more likely to get arthritis, and in fact, they're actually somewhat less likely. And there's plenty of evidence emerging now which shows that running actually helps promote cartilage growth and helps keep joints healthy. And in fact, we published a paper just very recently showing that arthritis rates have actually more than doubled since World War II as people become less physically active, and we can after we control for weight and various other factors. Maybe the most important myth I discuss in the book is that it's normal to be less active as we age, right? We have this idea that when we retire, you kind of kick your feet up, you go to the beach, you go to Florida, whatever it is, and you become less physically active. And indeed, Americans today, as they get older, are much, much, much less active, 50% less active than they were, say, in their 20s or 30s. But in the Paleolithic, of course, there is no retirement. And by the way, hunter-gatherers, if they survive childhood, are likely to live into their 70s or and often their 80s, but they don't get to retire. They don't get to stop working. And in fact, hunter-gatherers often work harder as they get older because they become what's called the grandparent hypothesis. They actually start foraging to get surplus food, which they feed to their children and their grandchildren. So here's a graph, for example, of research that was done by Kristen Hawkes and colleagues in the Hadza. These are hunter-gatherers in Tanzania, and you can see that mothers spent 2 to 5 hours a day digging, but grandmothers would spend 4 to 8 hours a day digging. So they would spend a lot more time foraging and getting food. working to feed their children and their grandchildren. And so I would argue that humans evolved to live past menopause and to be grandparents in order to be physically active, and that in turn that physical activity is important because it turns on repair and maintenance mechanisms, which helps keep us young, helps keep us vigorous, and helps keep us healthy. And so that's why, as we get older, the older we are, the more we benefit from physical activity. And the first major, really famous study that showed that was done actually on Harvard alumni by this fellow, Ralph Paffenbarger. So Paffenbarger realized, he was a professor at Harvard Medical School, that places like Harvard are fantastic to study aging and exercise because the alumni office keeps track of all the alumni, to constantly ask them for money, right? And so he got the alumni office to let him get data on alums as they were aging, and on their health and their physical activity levels. And he showed that this is physical activity on the x-axis, how much they get, so 500 calories a week up to 2,000 calories a week, and this is their rate of dying. And he showed that in the under 50 crowd, people who exercise 2,000 calories a week, right, which is not a huge amount. It's like going running, four times a week for like 5 miles. It's a moderate amount, but not a huge amount. Had about 21% lower death rates, but by the time they got into their 70s and 80s, that kind of physical activity had a 50% lower effect, lower death rate. So that's really an amazing effect, right? And many studies have shown the same thing. And by the way, it's never too late to start. If you start exercising later on in life, you still get an enormous benefit. Finally, last but not least, I wanted, the book ends by applying the sort of natural history of physical activity to health today. And there's lots to talk about, but one of them is the biggest problem, which is really how do you get people to exercise in the first place? As I've noted before, our modern approach to exercise is to commercialize it, to industrialize it, to medicalize it. We prescribe it, we sell it, right? And that's nothing wrong with that. I'm not opposed to that, but it doesn't obviously work because the vast majority of Americans are not, exercising despite our efforts to commercialize it, medicalize it. And I would argue that we should go back to this evolutionary and anthropological evidence that we've been confronting, which is that people evolved to be physically active for 2 reasons, and 2 reasons only: when it was necessary or when it was rewarding. And often rewarding meant being social. So let's, I think we can help people be physically active by making it both necessary and rewarding. And the best way to do that is by making it social. In the book, I go into great detail about ways to do that through commitment contracts and dancing and various other kinds of social activities. Another myth out there is that there's an optimal dose and type of exercise. People want to know exactly what to do. How much cardio should I do? How much weight should I do? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that's also problematic because there is no one optimal dose. It depends on who you are, whether you're male, whether you're female, how old you are, what your injury history is, and also what you care about, right? Are you interested in cancer, or are you worried about Alzheimer's? Are you worried about osteoporosis? And what's your genetic background? There is no one optimal dose and type of exercise. But that said, we know from lots of data, this is a study on well over 1 million Americans. This is weeks of moderate to vigorous minutes per week of moderate to vigorous physical activity. And by the way, you see it does not go down to 0 because we all have to die at some point, but against the relative risk of death adjusted for age. Whoops. And what you can see is that if you exercise just 60 minutes a week, you get a 30 to 40% reduction in your relative death rate. 150 minutes a week, which is again that standard recommendation, leads to a 50% reduction in the rate of death. And as you can see, if you continue to exercise at higher doses, you get increasing benefits, but the benefits start to tail off. And at a certain point, there really is no extra benefit to getting any more exercise. And then finally, last but not least, is this idea that exercise is a magic bullet against disease. And it is true that exercise does lower the risk of many common diseases. It decreases our vulnerability, right? And but not completely, right? If you can exercise and still get cancer, heart disease, respiratory tract infections, Alzheimer's, arthritis, depression, etc. But physical activity lowers the risk of all of these diseases quite substantially. For example, Alzheimer's is pretty much the only thing that's really known to prevent Alzheimer's is physical activity. You can lower your your likelihood of getting Alzheimer's by 30 to 40%. It has enormous effects on respiratory tract infections. There's no data yet on COVID, but for other kinds of respiratory tract infections, there's no question that moderate amounts of physical activity are very beneficial, incredibly beneficial for heart disease, et cetera. The list goes on, right? But the important point to realize, it's not that physical activity is medicine that can treats the disease. A better way of thinking about it is that the absence of regular physical activity increases your vulnerability to these mismatched diseases, which is why you still can get them without physical activity. But really, don't underestimate the fact that it really does. The absence really does increase your vulnerability to these diseases, and I explain in the book why that's the case. So I hope the book helps in many ways. I hope it entertains you. I hope it informs people. I hope it enlightens people. But most importantly, my goal in this book is to change the way we think about exercise in particular and the science of health in general. I think we've oversimplified things. I think we're biased by looking at Westerners and elite athletes and thinking too much about weight loss. I think we've over-commercialized and over-medicalized physical activity. And I think we're way too often judgmental and uncompassionate about people's natural, normal, basic inclinations not to want to do unnecessary physical activity. And finally, I hope the book is useful. I hope it gives you information about how to make exercise fun and necessary, and how and why it can be healthy and rewarding. Like, think about Ruth Bader Ginsburg and how she kept, so vital and strong up until her late 80s, in part by exercising. But most fervently, I hope the book helps you enjoy being active, and I hope it helps us be less exercised about exercise. And with that, I'll stop sharing, and I look forward to answering some questions. Thank you.
Yay, that was wonderful. Thank you so much for that. I love the visuals, and I love that you had GIFs that moved, and it was very entertaining. Thank you. I welcome anyone who's been watching us and has been here part of the author event. We have a couple minutes for a couple of questions. There's a chat that's right next to the screen that you're watching us on, and so you can log on and answer questions through there. I think one of the first ones to start with is a really interesting one, and you kind of mentioned this with the Iron Man and everything, but where do you even start writing a book like this? Like, where does the research start? How does that process work for you when trying to figure out, I've got to take all this wonderful information and this passionate topic and put it in, couple hundred pages, how does that start for you?
Well, this was not an easy book to write because
I'm sure.
because frankly, it's not much fun to read about exercise. I mean, I was trying to write a book not only for people who liked exercise, but also for people who are exercised about exercise. Mm-hmm. And so I was trying to figure out how to give it and it's not a normal story, right? There's not kind of a beginning and a middle and an end. Okay. So I was trying to figure out a way to construct it as a narrative, right? And so part of it was my own experiences. And when I told the story about Iron Man and the Tarahumara's, was true. That was how I sort of first started thinking about writing this book. And so I kind of took my cue from that. And began with physical inactivity because, if you're sitting watching this video or you're reading the book, you're probably, sitting, right? You're not exercising, right? So, I thought, let's tell the story of sitting and sleeping and resting metabolism, and then work my way through. So I kind of that's how I decided to give it the structure. And then over the last sort of 10 years or so, as I was thinking about the book, I took advantage every opportunity I had to have an experience. I just took it, running that race against horses in Arizona, or going on a hunting trip in Greenland in the middle of in the winter at 74 degrees north. It's a crazy thing to do, but I thought I should experience that. So I really went out of my way to try to do some participant observation, so that I could see for myself and experience for myself how people use their bodies in different cultures and in different ways, to kind of give some information about to kind of put flesh on the bones and this sort of narrative about physical activity and how weird it is, but also how beneficial it is.
Well, and I think that adds that personal touch that you put in with the stories and the experiences of your own life that you put in the book, make it, I don't know, they make it more human in a way. You know what I mean? There's a certain, when you read books about exercise or books that may be on topics that you don't necessarily know, having personal touches like that are always really helpful. I want to ask this question because I love it. Is there an audiobook version for those of us who don't want to sit down and read, but would rather listen and walk?
Yes, there is. And the guy who does the audiobook is really terrific. So there's an excellent audiobook. He actually also did the audiobook for my last book too. He's an excellent. And he's also a very serious biker too, cyclist. So he's also a bit of an exercise addict. But yes, he's an excellent audiobook.
I'm glad because although I am someone who I can read while I walk on the treadmill, I just have to walk though and it's just one place. I'm not having to walk in navigate at the same time. What's next for you? I know that this is a weird question sometimes when your book just came out and you're like, I just gave you this thing. You want to ask me for another one? But with someone who loves research and loves sharing your research in the form of these books with us, what has sparked your interest and maybe you're starting to get that research buzz again?
Well, I mean, my lab is still, despite the pandemic, I'm also a research scientist. I've got a lab. We publish tons and tons of papers every year. So, we've been doing lots of work on running biomechanics, on how shoes help affect feet. We're working on how muscles help affect inflammation. But in general, what my lab studies is how and why we evolved to be physically active and how that's relevant to health and disease. So we're looking at sitting and back pain. We're looking at a whole set of questions that are really about how people evolve to use their bodies and how the modern world, we use our bodies differently and how that can get us into trouble. And so I'm actually looking forward to getting back in the lab, and I never left the lab, but focusing a little bit more of my effort on the work that we're doing in the lab. But I am thinking about a new book. It's still bubbling around in my head, and it won't be for a long time for me to start it because first and foremost, I'm a research scientist, not a book writer.
That's okay. We're still grateful for the books that you do write that you can share with us in that way. What do you think is the most important thing that we can learn from they're asking like non-Western ideals, and when you visited various African countries, and what do you think is the one thing what most important thing that we can learn? Well, I'll phrase it in civilizations other than our own.
I would say that there's this. I think it's very helpful to step out of your own experience and question what's normal. We just think it's normal to, wear shoes and have central heating and eat breakfast cereal that comes from a box and fly around in tubes in the air and metal tubes in the air and all that. And it's like normal to think your life is normal, but our lives aren't normal. And I think that there's nothing wrong with the fact that we have, I love the fact that I live in the 21st century and I have all these technologies. And look at the fact that we're able to communicate via,
right?
This, when there's a pandemic, it's amazing, right? But so with all those benefits also comes some costs and some trade-offs, and everything has trade-offs. And I think it helps to evaluate those trade-offs. Like, for example, reading, right? Until recently, nobody read, right? Reading is a completely modern, strange, abnormal behavior, right? For which our brains are pre-adapted to do. But reading, has all these benefits, but also, has some costs in terms of, say, like myopia, right? You're more likely to have eye problems. So now I'm not going to say you shouldn't read because you're going to get myopia, but it helps us evaluate them, and we can learn more about what causes myopia. And it turns out that there are ways to prevent it through more exciting visual stimuli when you're young, et cetera, et cetera. So we can learn a lot. Just like I don't think everybody should be running barefoot just because our ancestors ran barefoot, but we can learn about running by studying barefoot running because it tells us how we evolved to run. And I think there's better and worse ways to run, and barefoot running helps us learn about that. And the same goes for diet, and certainly also for physical activity. It's useful to know that, when somebody tells you that gives you a hard time for slouching or sitting, for 8 hours a day, it's useful to know that actually we're evolved for that, we're adapted for that, and that there's nothing actually abnormal about it, and actually it's just a modern Victorian conception that slouching is bad for you. There's a whole section in the book on that, by the way. So if you like to slouch,
I wanted to go to my mother and be like, look, I told you, I can slouch.
It's true. It's true. our strong-backed hunter-gatherer, ancestors were probably slouching, right? And so it's just that, it was actually a German orthopedist from the 19th century decided that children should sit with straight backs. They should sit the way you stand, and that's just not true. But the list goes on, right? So I think there's a lot to learn. It's not a blueprint. It doesn't tell us how to live our lives, how to use our bodies. I'm glad that we have antibiotics and vaccines and refrigerators and all kinds of modern things, but we can still learn something from this our evolutionary past. And we can also learn something from looking at other cultures, because our culture is not necessarily the best way to do things. There are other wonderful ways to live one's life. I'm so impressed, and I've learned so much by spending time with the farmers in Africa that we work with in the community. That many of them are good friends, and the Tarahumara, learning how what they value, and it just kind of changes your perspective on the world and enriches your life and helps you question your priorities. And that's why travel is such a wonderful thing, right? It broadens us.
I think that's one of the perfect questions to end on, because that answer is so important, and not just for this book, but for in our lives. And I want to thank you for that reminder. I want to thank you for this wonderful book that you've given us. This, like I said, I never thought I'd be interested in that, but that's what books are for. They expand your horizons. And even if we can't travel right now, we'll travel through books, and we'll continue to learn that way. I want to give you a second, Daniel, to remind people who you are, remind them about your book before we close out here, where they might be able to find you online, or if you want to throw out any more research papers they should read. I want to give you a minute or two to do that before we close out.
All right, well, just a reminder, my name is Dan Lieberman. I'm a professor at Harvard in the Department of Human Evolutionary Biology. And the book is Exercised, Why Something We Never Evolved to Do is Healthy and Rewarding. My previous book is called The Story of the Human Body, Health, Evolution, and Disease, which I still in print. And that's really about mismatched diseases. And you can quickly find my website if you Google me. Most of my research papers are available online, so you can see what we're doing and my students are doing and classes that I teach. And but really, my passion is really to figure out how we can use an evolutionary perspective on what happened in human evolution to help make people healthier and use their bodies better. Because I believe that some of us are interested in philosophy, right? What's the right way to live your life, right? And you don't want to die at the end of your life regretting that you didn't live the right life, that you wasted that one chance to go through life. And I believe that we need a philosophy of the body as well, right? That you don't want to die thinking I didn't use my body the way it should have been used, right? And I think that this kind of evolutionary,
or a cross stitch or a bumper sticker, a philosophy for the body. I love that. Love that.
Well, I think that's what we need, and I think in our modern sort of stitch 'em up kind of medicalized world where you go see a doctor only after you get sick, rather than before you get sick. I mean, our medical system is not really designed to keep us healthy. It's designed to help us recover from illness and disease. And sometimes it has its benefits. I'm not opposed to that. But the main determinants of health are social and behavioral and to some extent genetics, but you can't change your genetics. And we just don't give that enough attention. And I think an evolutionary anthropological perspective can help us live happier, healthier lives.
And on that note, I want to thank you again for visiting us here on the virtual Tattered cover. When the next book comes out, if that's your future, we'll hopefully have you back in our physical stores. You guys can buy Exercise as well as Dan's other books at tatteredcover.com, or stop in at one of our 4 locations. We are all open from 10 to 6, 7 days a week. Just come in, wear your mask, and we appreciate you guys supporting local businesses. And Dan, if you'll stay on the line here before I close out, I just want to say thank you guys so much. Once again, you can get Exercised by Mr. Daniel Lieberman. I probably should say Dr. Lieberman here at tatteredcover.com. Stay safe, everyone, and happy reading. And we're out.